Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how might we periodize skill acquisition in a manner similar to physical training, taking into account factors like specificity, load, progression, and reversibility? A look at the skill acquisition periodization and periodization of skill training frameworks. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at a really important concept that has been gaining a lot of interest recently, the periodization of skill acquisition. As most people know, in physical training, or S&C, there is a long history of using systematic approaches to developing training schedules over both short and longer timescales. The ones that come to mind most readily for me are the typical training programs designed for long-distance runners, where you build up total mileage and the length of your weekend long run within shorter 4-week blocks, then have cut-back weeks to prevent injury and burnout. This typically also involves different types of running, for example, recovery and speed work, and things like weight training. This example illustrates that most physical training involves periodization, which can be defined as short and long-term planning to prescribe specific workloads and tasks. Within these domains, there are also typically well-developed procedures for monitoring progress, for example, looking at your heart rate in running, so that the training plan is not completely rigid and can be adapted based on the athlete's response to the training and their developmental status. Until very recently, these are concepts that we haven't really thought a lot about in motor learning and skill acquisition research. A likely reason for this is that in most studies, we use very simple tasks that can be learned within a few hours or few days and require very little adaptability. So there was no real reason to think about the longer term. Should we and can we develop a similar periodization approach to skill training? How should we be adjusting what, how, and when we practice so that the performers can acquire skills as quickly and efficiently as possible? What factors should we take into account? What should we be monitoring to determine when it's appropriate to progress to a new type of practice? How should this relate to the stages involved in acquiring skills? These are the kind of questions I want to try to tackle today. For this, I'm going to look at two different recent models proposed for periodizing skill training. By skill training, I'm referring to what Keith Davids and colleagues have defined as the ability of an athlete to seek, explore, discover, assemble, and stabilize the coordination of movement patterns. The first model and paper I want to look at was published by Damien Farrow and Sam Robertson in 2017. In their introduction, the authors emphasized that skill training periodization is an underdeveloped area with really no existing frameworks. As they point out, a large part of the problem is the lack of comparable load monitoring in skill training, with the bulk of studies and models focusing solely on performance outcomes rather than the underlying processes, which can often be difficult to observe and measure objectively. A related issue is the one that I've talked about many times on the podcast already, the performance versus learning paradox in skill acquisition. To have a long-term view of skill, we need to separate temporary short-term effects from longer-term learning. In their paper, the authors next develop a skill acquisition periodization or SAP framework built off some core principles from motor learning. The first concept considered in their framework is specificity. For this, the authors build off the concept of representative learning design, which, as we know, is the extent to which the practice prescribed reflects the psychological demands of competition. It is proposed that in practice we should be striving for a high level of representativeness, but they also point out an important issue that needs to be considered. That is, it has been shown that higher representativeness is associated with a higher load on the athlete, both physically and cognitively. For example, relative to comparable low representative practice, high representativeness in soccer training has been shown to involve greater intensity, greater cognitive exertion, more distance covered, and more decision-making complexity. Another example can be seen in rock climbing research. Specifically, increased anxiety and narrowed attention, analogous to increased load, have been found in wall and rock climbing task situations situated higher from the ground than an identical, less representative task lower to the ground. So in other words, throwing an athlete right into highly representative practice is the psychological equivalent of loading a bar up with a ton of weights or planning a very long run at the start of training. Or in the author's words, developing a greater understanding of this relationship between load and task representativeness is critical when the longitudinal demands of high-performance training are considered. To properly take these effects into account in developing a training program, the authors propose to break training down in terms of the constraints manipulations used. For example, in soccer, consider task constraints of the time given to a player before they have to pass the ball and the number of players on the field, and an environmental constraint of the size of the field. Within these constraints, there can be different levels of complexity. For example, making a quick pass with lots of players on a small field is a high level of complexity. Farrow and Robertson suggest measuring and/or planning the number of attempts that will be made at different levels of each of these constraints. For example, if the player made 200 passes in the microcycle, 50 might be performed in 1 to 2 seconds, 60 in 2 to 3 seconds, and 90 in over 3 seconds. We can then convert these into percentages and make week-to-week comparisons in the load being placed on the player in terms of the complexity of the constraint. Again, with a higher load corresponding to greater specificity or representativeness. The next concept they consider is progression. They point out that this can be defined both in terms of actual improvements in the skill, that is, outcome measures of performance, or in an athlete's capacity to complete and tolerate an increased skill practice load. Quote, "This load can be represented using a number of methods such as increased practice repetition volume, increased technical demand, higher practice representativeness, or increased mental exertion." End quote. Therefore, key factors in designing an appropriate practice goal include consideration of the current skill level of the performer, as well as the relative difficulty of the skill being practiced. For this, the authors suggest the challenge point framework, which I discussed back at episode 105, provides a useful starting point in their SAP framework. Importantly, they also point out that, quote, "The purpose of a given skill practice session also needs to be considered, as there are occasions when skill progression is not necessarily the focus. For example, the development of an athlete's confidence may be the priority, which will likely require different practice demands." End quote. From this, we have all the pieces to build and monitor a training program. By using the common method in physical training of multiplying intensity, or in this case complexity as I described in the last section, by frequency, we can obtain the load of a particular practice activity. The athlete's success in these tasks can then be used to determine whether we are meeting the right level of challenge. We can then build a training program that progresses in terms of load, but is adjusted and delivered in terms of the challenge based on the athlete, in terms of their performance success. These two components nicely correspond to the nominal and functional task difficulty in the challenge point hypothesis. The next concept examined in their framework is overload. For this, the authors pull in another concept that can be related to the cognitive demands of a practice task, contextual interference. Mirroring what I said in my recent episode on adaptive training, the authors state, quote, "When considered in a periodization framework, the contextual interference literature is also clear that in early learning, an increasingly blocked, low mental effort practice approach may at times be utilized, and even preferable. As learning progresses, so too should the challenge demanded to the performer. In this case, practice can be structured in a more random manner in order to increase the mental effort." End quote. Again, when thinking about how this progression between blocked and random practice should occur, the authors appeal to the degree of challenge. Quote, "Once a period of skill stability or consistency of execution is seen, that is a signal to a coach to change the structure, organization, or information provided in practice to further load the performer." This concept is similar to the approach used in resistance training programs, where the sets and repetitions are manipulated as an athlete begins to perform the various exercises with some degree of ease. End quote. To create overload in the training program, a coach can focus on the particular constraint being used. In the soccer example, they could systematically increase the percentage of passes made with the shortest 1 to 2 second processing time. The next concept considered in the SAP framework is reversibility, which is the idea that the beneficial gains of training will be lost if the athlete stops or reduces the amount of practice. In motor learning research, we of course have developed methods for assessing this, in particular retention and transfer tests of performance. Retention tests assess the relative permanency of skill change and separate learning from short-term transient factors like fatigue and motivation level, while transfer tests assess the adaptability of the skill change to different performance contexts, with the ultimate question, of course, being whether the gains seen in practice transfer to real competition. Of course, within these issues of reversibility and permanency of skill, we also need to acknowledge the role of consolidation. As the authors state, Recovery, whether sleeping, napping, or simply breaking from the physical or mental demands of a skill, is likely to be beneficial to overall skill progression. The final issue Farrow and Robertson consider in their framework is tedium, which of course is a state of being bored due to the monotony of a training program. To combat this, the authors appeal to Bernstein's famous concept of repetition without repetition. Quote, "It is futile to attempt to practice or train in a manner whereby the aim is to imprint a specific movement pattern, such as through the use of highly monotonous and repetitive practice. Hence, Bernstein argued that practice should be focused on repeating the means of solving the problem rather than simply trying to repeat the solution. In other words, variety over tedium." End quote. So to summarize, the SAP framework proposes to develop a periodization plan for skill training by pulling in several classic concepts from the motor learning literature. Skill training load can be nominally defined in terms of the level of representativeness or complexity of the constraints placed on the athlete, and the amount of contextual interference created by the variability in the practice schedule. Progression can be functionally assessed in terms of the challenge placed on the performer by looking at the performance success in handling different training loads. The reversibility or loss can be assessed with retention and transfer tests. Finally, increased variability in practice as the performer progresses will promote repetition without repetition and reduce tedium. I will consider all of this a bit more shortly, but first I want to look at the second periodization framework that has been proposed. The second paper I want to look at today is one published by Audi and colleagues in 2019. In this paper, the authors build on Farrow and Robertson's SAP framework with a particular focus on the growing trend of specialist skill coaches, for example, a goalkeeper coach in soccer. The authors argue that a skill acquisition framework is particularly important in this type of coaching because the narrow focus on one particular skill can lead to using very non-representative, low variability practice designs that do not allow for sufficient exploration of coordination solutions. Quote, "Driven by anecdotal evidence and abiding scientific concerns about the coach's choice of training activities, we aim to circumvent the risk of specialist coaches moving towards traditional coaching methods. In detail, several features may be displayed by traditional coaching. 1. Limited performance uncertainty and variability of actions. 2. Decontextualized movement coordination from the performance. And 3. Monotonous and repetitive technical drills in training." End quote. In their article, the authors praised the SAP framework proposed by Farrow and Robertson, but question whether coaches working at lower levels and on their own as a specialist will have the equipment, time, and knowledge to make the measurements proposed in their framework. The SAP framework also seems more suited for year-long or multi-year training programs, whereas specialist coaches often only get to work with athletes for a short period of time. As an alternative, the authors proposed the periodization of skill training or POST framework as a model of skill development and refinement specifically targeted at specialist coaches in sport. The framework examines both how to periodize skill training environments over the course of micro and macro cycles, that is, multiple sessions over weeks and months, and within a single training session. Similar to the SAP framework, POST is founded on constraints manipulations. Quote, "To relate the theoretical perspective of the CLA, in connection with its theoretical underpinnings, back to the subject of skill training and its periodization, it appears to be essential for coaches to gain an understanding of how they can organize and manipulate task constraints so as to allow athletes to explore and discover relevant information within the training environment. Thus, the CLA provides a theoretical perspective which can allow coaches to meet individual athletes' needs by manipulating the learning environment." End quote. The authors next identify 3 challenges facing a coach in terms of managing the training environment. I will briefly discuss these and then talk more specifically about how they are addressed in the framework. Challenge 1 is appropriately introducing representativeness and task specificity in training. Because more advanced performers typically are perceptually attuned to different and more specifying information sources as compared to their lesser skilled counterparts, it's critical that training represent different levels of the dynamic information present in competition, so that learners can become attuned and educate their attention to the specifying information. Challenge number 2 is finding a balance between stability and instability. As I discussed back in episode 158 when looking at motor learning as a search through a perceptual motor landscape, a key to effective skill development seems to be balancing exploitation, that is, developing and enhancing a movement solution that is stable in the face of perturbations in the environment, and exploration, going through periods of relative instability to find new and potentially more effective solutions. As the authors nicely put it, in simple terms, coach-induced coordination changes in training aim at enhancing an athlete's ability to achieve the same task goal in different ways and support the search for, exploration of, and exploitation of the use of the same solution to respond to different problems." End quote. The third and final challenge is managing the level of information complexity in training. In the POST framework, the authors focus particularly on altering the information movement coupling in the control of action. For example, by changing the speed of a dribbling attacker or spacing between players in soccer. For this, they point to two things a coach can do. One, modifying task constraints and equipment, and two, managing practice task schedules. Quote, "Alongside manipulating commonly advocated task constraints such as instruction, rule changes, or playing area or surface adjustments, benefits of modifying equipment for the management of information complexity are proposed. In particular, the removal or addition of perceptual information is considered to support or challenge athletes' exploration for functional perception action couplings and movement solutions." I've talked about a few different examples of this in the podcast already. For example, back in episode 89, I looked at scaling equipment for younger athletes, while in episode 164, I looked at how visual constraints can be used to facilitate skill acquisition. In terms of practice schedules, the authors propose that increasing both intra and inter-task interference may lead athletes to explore the training environment for more relevant information. Now let's look at how you periodize all of this in the POST framework. For this, the authors build off Carl Newell's three-stage model of motor learning, which I'll be diving into more detail in a few weeks. But for now, in the POST framework, these stages are called coordination training, skill adaptability training, and performance training. Overall, when planning or periodizing skill training, coaches are encouraged to focus on two main areas. First, the relevant skill training stage for the individual athlete, and second, managing the level of task representativeness and perceived task complexity. These factors are nicely illustrated in a figure shown in the paper. Across the three stages of motor learning, the representativeness of training is expected to increase and decrease depending on the goal of the particular practice session. Task complexity, on the other hand, progressively increases from low to high across these stages. A nice aspect of this framework that differentiates it from other skill acquisition models is that it recognizes that there can be both progression and regression through the different stages of learning. Quote, "Notably, for coaches to further manage the level of perceived task complexity and facilitate a learning environment that is appropriate for the individual athletes, movement back and forth between the skill training stages should be considered. In particular, practitioners may need to facilitate skill reorganization processes. For example, freezing and refreezing motor system degrees of freedom to induce movement stability, and skill optimization processes. For example, the functional grouping of motor degrees of freedom. The movements between various skill training substages for single learners are supported by basic tenets of nonlinear pedagogy. These in particular highlight 1. Motor learning as a nonlinear process, i.e. athletes show different rates of skill learning and different timescales for progression. 2. The need for individualized and varied pathways for learning. And 3. The absence of a single best way of learning and teaching, i.e. the same training approach may affect individual performers' learning differently." End quote. The authors next go more specifically into each stage of training. The first stage, coordination training, is focused on searching for and exploring coordination movements within the training environment. In order to acquire basic movement patterns and stable coordination structures, performers in this stage should experience rather low levels of environmental variability and task complexity. The idea here is to create a scaled-down version of the task which reduces the degrees of freedom to meet the athlete's skill level, while at the same time keeping a degree of representativeness by maintaining the information-action couplings and interactions between players that occur in a real game. For example, when training a soccer goalkeeper, this phase would focus on the acquisition of fundamental movements such as catching and diving, while retaining intact player-environment interactions. For example, a coach may dribble and shoot slowly, allowing the goalkeeper to get set, perceive the moment of ball-foot contact, and time movement coordination towards catching the shot. Producing consistent performance outcomes under these controlled environmental conditions over a set period of time, for example, several training sessions, would be regarded as a trigger for coaches and athletes to progress to the second skill training stage of skill adaptability training. In the second stage, skill adaptability training, the idea is to move the athlete away from using freezing as a solution to the degrees of freedom problem towards the much more effective use of coordinative structures, which I discussed back in episode 157. As I discussed in that episode, coordinative structures are a higher level solution because the movements of different body parts and degrees of freedom are synergistic and compensate for each other. Coordinative structures are also much more resilient in the face of environmental perturbations. In order to facilitate this process, the POST framework proposes 3 substages within this stage of learning. 1, movement variability training, 2, complex training, and 3, team-based training. The movement variability training substage of skill adaptability training focuses on enhancing the ability of the athlete to adapt movement patterns in response to changing constraints in the environment. Quote, "This substage is driven by the aim of challenging performers to more actively search for relevant information sources and adapt micro-component features of movement solutions, i.e., within skill variability. Predominantly, this would be within a stable affordance landscape and under varying levels of task complexity. Methodological approaches within the stage of movement variability training could include, for example, differential learning or the addition of changing parameters and modified equipment to the movement task at hand." End quote. Again, referring to the example of training a soccer goalkeeper, this could involve adjusting the ball speed or size or the shooting distance. Peripheral vision could be limited with special glasses, etc. So in general, this stage still focuses on a single movement task in a training environment, including 1 or 2 athletes. Conversely, in the complex training substage, the goal is to confront performers with multiple movements via a further increase of information complexity. For example, smaller training groups consisting of a larger number of players. At first, these movement tasks should share some common features and structural task similarities. For example, diving to catch a shot and diving to punch a cross for a soccer goalkeeper. Quote, "By limiting movement tasks to those with structural commonalities, athletes should be encouraged to explore a smaller perceptual motor landscape while continuously trying to adapt movement solutions and achieve the task outcome." End quote. This is where variability in practice schedules can also be emphasized, focusing on between-skill variability of unrelated movement skills. The third substage, team-based training, reintroduces game-like structures to practice through, for example, the use of small-sided or conditioned games. The third and final developmental stage in the POST framework is performance training. This is meant to occur close to competition at a point in training where the goals are increasing efficiency and confidence as opposed to skill development necessarily. This training should be at the highest level of representativeness, for example using 11 versus 11 in soccer, and focus more on aspects like pre-game routines and strategy in facing a specific opponent. In the last part of the paper, the authors discuss more specifically how all of these things can be applied and provide some nice examples of graphs and charts that could be used to plan and evaluate practices. I definitely recommend you check it out. Link to a PDF copy in the show notes. So to sum up, today I looked at 2 different frameworks for periodizing skill training. While I think they have a bit of ways to go to be realistically usable for most coaches, they're a very good start. If you're not doing it already, I think it's a really useful exercise for a coach to sit down and plot out how training is going to progress in terms of the complexity of constraints, degree of representativeness, and level of within and between task variability, and plan some progression in these aspects of practice. I think this is an excellent way to quantify and vary training load in a manner analogous to physical training. Along with these guiding frameworks I talked about today, there's some really nice tools out there already for doing this. For constraints, the CLA book published by Renshaw and colleagues in 2019 provides some nice tables and example of structuring constraints. For representativeness, have a look at the Krauss and colleagues' work on tennis, which I discussed back in episode 133. Finally, for practice variability, I would consider using Buzzard and Farrell's method for quantifying and planning this, which I discussed in episode 91. Doing all of this is definitely more work than slapping together a few of the same old drills, but I think it will pay dividends in the long run by allowing for better reflection and comparison between training outcomes. I also really like the breakdown of skill training into the 3 stages of coordination, adaptability, and performance used in the POST model. This really highlights the critical point that not all practice sessions necessarily should be focused on learning. Thinking about the first part of skill development as a transition from freezing to coordinative structures, in my opinion, is a more sound and representative approach to developing quote-unquote technique than is traditionally used. I'll be discussing this a bit more in a future episode. Where I think these frameworks are lacking a bit is in the monitoring aspect, and particularly knowing when it's appropriate to progress to the next level, or alternatively, when a regression back to an earlier stage may be more appropriate. Defining this in terms of performance outcomes may not always be appropriate because movements that are functional may not be optimal. In particular, at early stages of learning, performance success could occur with a movement pattern that is likely to produce injury over the longer term. See my episode number 159 where I talked about the challenge of identifying optimal movement patterns. And what is the appropriate level of stability of a movement for progression to the next stage? Determining these things is, of course, part of the art of coaching. But in the end, I think these two frameworks are an excellent starting point to the very important issue of skill training periodization. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter @ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.